All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk with Professor Mary Ziegler. I'm Hannah Herrera from the German-American Institute here in Tübingen. I will be moderating this event tonight. Before we get started, I would like to thank our cooperation partners for supporting this event tonight. Thank you to the Frauenbuchladen in Tübingen, to BAF, the Bildungszentrum und Archiv zur Frauengeschichte Baden-Württembergs, and to the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. A quick word about our institute. The German-American Institute of Tübingen, or d.a.i, is a nonprofit cultural and educational organization that aims to support German-American relations. Feel free to browse our website, follow us on social media, or sign up for our weekly newsletter. We have an English language library. We offer English and Spanish courses and cultural events, concerts, and talks both live and online, such as this one tonight. Some highlights we have planned for this quarter include the Fiddle Meets Voice concert with Young Sounds from Indigenous Canada on Tuesday, February 7th at 8 p.m. at our institute, or the event Living in a Trans World on Tuesday, March 7th at 7 p.m., also taking place at our institute, which will include a double feature film screening of the films Gender Knots and Generation, split up with a talk with director Monica Treut. Check out the link to our program schedule below for more information. For past events, a schedule of future live streams, and to be notified of future events, subscribe to our YouTube channel. This event tonight and many of the events that we offer are free. If you would like to support our program, follow the link to donate below. We would be very grateful if you would take a moment after the live stream tonight to fill out our feedback form. You can find the link to that below as well. That being said, let's move on to tonight's talk, The Fall of the Right to Choose, Abortion Laws in the US. Professor Ziegler will give us a keynote for about 30 minutes, so feel free to post questions in the chat during the talk so that we can address them in the Q&A afterwards. Our guest speaker tonight is Mary Ziegler, one of the world's leading authorities on the legal history of abortion in the United States. She is a 2004 graduate of Harvard College and a 2007 graduate of Harvard Law School, and has taught at the St. Louis University School of Law, at Florida State University College of Law, was the Daniel P.S. Paul Visiting Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School, and is currently the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at the University of California at Davis School of Law. Her research interests and expertise include constitutional law, reproductive rights and violence, gender, sexuality and law, and legal history. Professor Ziegler is the author of various works on social movement struggles around reproduction, autonomy, and the law, including Reproduction in the Constitution, published by Routledge in 2022, Dollars for Life, The Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment, published by Yale University Press, also in 2022, and Abortion and the Law in America, A Legal History, Roe v. Wade to the Present, which was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. Her newest book, Roe, The Her Story of a National Obsession, is forthcoming, and she is currently working on a history of the fetal personhood movement. Her expertise has been requested not only by our institute, but by the New York Times, CNN, BBC, and the Washington Post, to name a few. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening and hand it over to her. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome, Mary Ziegler.
Thanks for having me. So I'm going to take the time today to ask the kind of how did this happen question, and then talk a little bit about what may be coming next for reproductive rights in America. So as a starting point, we all know that the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, overruled Roe v. Wade, which recognized a right to choose abortion in the United States last June. So the Roe decision had come down in 1973. And at that point in time, there was about 2 states in the United States that had entirely decriminalized abortion. There were another roughly dozen that allowed abortions only in cases of rape and incest, threats to maternal health, and certain fetal abnormalities. And the rest of the states criminalized abortion unless the patient's health was at risk. So Roe was kind of a lightning bolt in the United States. It made most laws then on the books unconstitutional. And it held that the right to privacy, which is not spelled out in the text of the US Constitution, is broad enough to encompass the decision to have an abortion. And really almost immediately after, there was a strong response to Roe, in part because the American anti-abortion movement had existed well before Roe. In fact, the American anti-abortion movement had come into being, at least the modern version of the movement, in the 1960s, when states began reforming existing laws. At that time, most states had laws that dated to the 19th century, when the American Medical Association had fought to criminalize abortion early as well as late in pregnancy. Up until that point, in American law, abortion had been criminalized only after quickening, which is the point at which fetal movement could be detected. The AMA had fought successfully to change that in most states, and that had been the regime that had prevailed. The problem began to be that doctors were interested in performing abortions that they thought were medically necessary or at least medically indicated that were not supported by the law. They began to do this and then get into trouble. Hospitals responded by forming therapeutic abortion committees, which would kind of weigh in on when abortion was or wasn't allowed. And this prompted some doctors to think that the problem wasn't with the doctors making the decisions, but with the laws themselves. But as soon as states began considering kind of modest reforms to their abortion laws, there was a backlash from abortion opponents, initially from Catholics, who argued that abortion was a violation of a biblical principle, but eventually the movement secularized and expanded and argued that abortion wasn't immoral alone, it was also unconstitutional because it violated the rights of the fetus or unborn child to equality under the law and due process of the law. So there wasn't really much prospect of a meaningful compromise on abortion before Roe v. Wade. When states proposed modest laws allowing for only narrow exceptions to abortion bans from conception, abortion opponents rallied to reject them. The same was true of laws that allowed abortion only until a certain point in pregnancy. So there was already a pretty heated battle in state legislatures, in ballot initiatives, and in the courts when Roe came down. And so to no one's surprise, the conflict continued after Roe. And I think to understand what happened, right, how Roe was overturned, you have to understand that it's a story not primarily about new arguments, because the claims that were raised by people like the lawyers for the state of Mississippi in the case that was decided this June, or the friend of court briefs submitted by anti-abortion organizations, none of those were new arguments. And nothing that the Supreme Court said in the Dobbs ruling hadn't been said for decades before. What was new was the political and cultural environment that made it possible for the Supreme Court to openly embrace those arguments. So I'd submit to you really that the story of the overruling of Roe is a story about the transformation of American political parties and American democracy writ large, more than it is just a story about abortion and American exceptionalism about abortion. So I want to tell you a little bit about that story and then tell you where I think the United States stands now, which is, within a few days of what would have been the 50th anniversary of the Roe decision. So in the immediate aftermath of Roe, anti-abortion organizations returned to what had been their kind of first principle, which was the idea that there was no constitutionally permitted abortion, period, in states that wanted abortion to be legal or in states that did not. So they began promoting an amendment to the federal constitution in the United States that would treat the fetus or unborn child as a rights-holding person. And they understood this to mean that abortion would be prohibited, right? That isn't a given. As you know, in Germany and some other countries, there are references to fetal protections and constitutional traditions that don't then lead to flat criminal bans on abortion. But people in the anti-abortion movement believed that a constitutional amendment banning abortion, at least as they designed it, would be at least prohibiting, if not outright criminalizing, all abortions. And there were such amendments that were introduced in Congress. The fight for an amendment led the anti-abortion movement to align with the Republican Party in the United States. Until the 1980s, it would have been incoherent to ask an American which party in the US is in favor of legal abortion and which party is against it, because you had politicians in both parties who could be found on either side. So for example, when you had one of the most prominent pro-choice politicians of the era was Nelson Rockefeller, who would be the vice president under Republican Gerald Ford. Thomas Eagleton, who was a running mate vice presidential running mate of a Democratic candidate in the 70s, or at least was considered to be as a possibility, was one of the most prominent anti-abortion senators in the United States. So it was quite possible that you would see politicians divide in unconventional ways. But this fight for a constitutional amendment led the anti-abortion movement essentially to align with whichever party would be willing to endorse a constitutional ban. And that in 1980 turned out to be the party of Ronald Reagan. Reagan believed at the time that emphasizing social issues like abortion might be a way to peel off Catholics and evangelical Protestants who had traditionally voted for the Democratic Party for economic reasons or just because of regional tradition. The fight, though, to get a constitutional amendment wasn't going anywhere for some unsurprising reasons. American public opinion on abortion looks not very different from opinion in most of Europe when you dig into polling. Most Americans support the idea of legal abortion, at least until the 15th or 20th week of pregnancy, with some exceptions thereafter. They, like many others, become more uncomfortable with abortion the later in pregnancy you get. And so the idea of a constitutional amendment, which would require supermajority support in Congress and in the states, was almost a impossible proposition from the outset. And that remained true even when the Republican Party, which was aligned with the anti-abortion movement, gained control of both houses of Congress and the White House. At the time, it was still clear that there would be no flat ban on abortion possible, and anti-abortion groups were hopelessly divided about what a better alternative would look like. And so effectively, they did nothing at all, and a constitutional amendment seemed impossible. The question then became really, for people in the American anti-abortion movement, what was the point? What could be done next? Because the entire movement had organized around the idea that abortion was unconstitutional, and by extension, that a movement amendment would be necessary. The answer came, I think, from a somewhat unlikely place on the Supreme Court. The court had just struck down an abortion ordinance from the town of Akron, Ohio, and Sandra Day O'Connor, who was Ronald Reagan's first Supreme Court nominee, had written a dissent criticizing the Roe decision, essentially saying it was unworkable, that it didn't make any sense. And anti-abortion lawyers looked at this and thought, well, this is something we can work with, because if it mattered, if Ronald Reagan could put more people like O'Connor on the Supreme Court, then maybe we can get Roe v. Wade overturned. Maybe even we could get a Supreme Court that would say abortion is unconstitutional, the way it was at the time in the Republic of Ireland, for example. So a new strategy evolved, right, that would justify the partnership with the Republican Party, because Republican presidents could nominate people to the Supreme Court and Republican senators could vote to confirm them. At first, the strategy really was one that just assumed that if Republicans were in office, they would put the right kinds of people on the court. And that was the strategy the movement used really from the 1980s until the 1990s. The movement would pass laws that made it harder for American women to get abortions and other people who are pregnant. Then it would defend those laws before the Supreme Court. And at the same time, it would fight to elect Republicans who would reshape the court, moving it toward an eventual day when Roe v. Wade would be undone. Everyone expected that day to come in 1992, and the court decided a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. There were more than enough Republican nominees on the court. The court had been telegraphing that it was interested in reversing Roe. And yet when the moment came, the court demurred. The court decided to preserve what it called the essential holding of Roe, that there's a right to choose abortion before viability, but didn't leave abortion rights unscathed. They made it easier for states to regulate abortion. So while this was the beginning of a world in which there was a patchwork in the United States, where abortion access varied tremendously depending on someone's zip code and depending on someone's level of wealth and often their race and age, it also was a crisis for the anti-abortion movement, which had thought it had a guarantee that Roe v. Wade would be overturned. And so in trying to figure out what went wrong, the anti-abortion movement's leaders concluded that they had too little power over the Republican Party, that the Republican Party would essentially say all the right things, but when the moment came, would do very little on abortion because American voters were not ultimately comfortable with outright abortion bans. And so in seeking new ways to influence the party, anti-abortion leaders began looking beyond the abortion issue itself. They focused, for example, on campaign finance. suggesting that if Republicans could raise and spend unlimited amounts of money on elections, they would win more and do more to ban abortion, but also that if anti-abortion groups themselves could outspend political parties and other institutional actors, that they might gain more power over candidates and the policies they decided. So then began a quest from the anti-abortion movement, a kind of improbable quest to change the rules on campaign finance. This is not something that would strike many as something natural for the anti-abortion movement to do, because the American anti-abortion movement, while pretty well funded, is hardly as well-to-do as many for-profit corporations or mega donors. But the goal the movement had was not just to lead to a world where there was more money in politics, but also a world in which grassroots groups, movements, and interest groups had more spending power than they had traditionally. So groups began to challenge lots of campaign finance rules to align with other groups opposed to campaign finance. It was an anti-abortion lawyer, James Bopp Jr., who was behind the litigation of the famous Citizens United case, which allowed corporations to make unlimited independent expenditures. The plan in Citizens United had originally been dark money, right, allowing conservative donors to give unlimited amounts without disclosing their identities. But ultimately, anti-abortion groups capitalized on what Citizens United turned out to be, challenging the balance of spending in the GOP away from conventional actors like parties and toward independent groups like nonprofit corporations, super PACs, and others that tended to be more ideologically extreme. So this fight, I think, led in part to the rise of more extreme Republicans, who were helped by many other factors like the rise of the conservative media and the polarization of the American electorate, but were also helped by the very different world of campaign spending that cropped up in the aftermath of Citizens United. This shift also, of course, gave the anti-abortion movement more influence over the GOP, as did anti-abortion efforts to make it harder to vote. James Bopp, for example, represented a group called True the Vote, which monitored polls, reported what its members saw as fraud, brought lawsuits to discourage mail-in balloting or institute voter ID requirements. There were other groups like the Thomas More Society that engaged in similar initiatives. These efforts, I think, also gave the anti-abortion movement more of a say over who sat on the Supreme Court. So it was not enough, quite clearly, to have a Supreme Court that was aligned with the GOP or that was conservative or that pursued traditionally conservative methodologies, whether that was originalism or textualism or something along those lines. There had to be judges who were willing to risk the kind of political backlash that would likely accompany the elimination of abortion rights in the US. The model for this kind of judge for the anti-abortion movement was Clarence Thomas, who had faced a kind of backlash in the 90s when he was nominated because he was accused of sexual harassment by several former coworkers, including Professor Anita Hill. Thomas's response to this, which was very defiant, he called the accusations a high-tech lynching, struck anti-abortion activists as a great proxy for how he would respond if he did something else that were deeply unpopular, like reverse Roe. So the gold standard became not just a judge who was conservative or interpreted the Constitution a particular kind of way, but a judge who was unconcerned about the views of the public, the views of the legal community writ large, someone who saw himself as sort of more of a crusader or someone with an absolute commitment to his idea of how the Constitution should be interpreted. And so by 2016, you began to see Donald Trump picking justices who didn't fit the conventional mold. For years, presidents had picked Supreme Court justices with an eye to minimizing risk, right? With an eye to maximizing the odds that someone would be ultimately confirmed by Congress. Donald Trump's nominees were not really designed to do that. They were designed to be a way to get sympathetic voters out to the polls, to energize the base, to deliver on what Trump saw as campaign promises, in particular, a campaign promise to get rid of Roe v. Wade. And that's, of course, precisely what the Supreme Court did in June. So the Dobbs decision involved a Mississippi ban on abortion at 15 weeks. It's worth emphasizing that this was not a pressing legal matter the court had to investigate. There were only two such laws on the books in the United States at the time Dobbs was decided. There was no disagreement in the lower courts about the constitutionality of these laws. And initially, when the case had begun, Mississippi had not even focused on asking the court to overturn Roe. It had asked a much more modest question. So this really struck many legal experts as an example of the court kind of reaching out to decide an issue it didn't have to confront, rather than the court being pulled into a kind of culture war against its will. In deciding that Roe should be overturned, the court compared it to Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a notorious case involving racial segregation, where the court upheld the idea of separate but equal. And so the court was saying, in effect, this is as bad as a decision gets. In reasoning this way, the court emphasized that all rights, right, the only rights that are unenumerated, that is not spelled out in the text of the US Constitution, are rights that are deeply rooted in tradition and history. That isn't a term that, defines itself. So what does that mean? Well, Justice Alito suggested that it meant at the time the relevant part of the Constitution, here the 14th Amendment, was written. So did the people who wrote the 14th Amendment, which is of course a group that consisted at the time of pretty much exclusively relatively wealthy white men, believe that there was a right to abortion? The next step Alito took was to focus on a particular set of historians. At the time, and really ever since historians have seriously considered this matter, it was widely accepted that abortion had been legal before quickening. That was changing at the time the 14th Amendment was written, but in a kind of complicated and messy way. Alito didn't see things that way. He cited a trio of historians with ties to the anti-abortion movement, and said essentially abortion had always been considered immoral, if not outright criminal, throughout pregnancy, from ancient times onward, and that in any rate it didn't matter if abortion had been considered okay before, because by the 19th century it had clearly been ruled out of limits. And if abortion had been criminalized by that time, it clearly couldn't be a fundamental right. Alito even rejected arguments for abortion rights that hadn't really been raised by either of the parties in the case, like the idea that abortion was a matter of equality for women. Alito rejected that argument, ironically, by saying the Supreme Court had already confronted it in cases involving pregnancy discrimination and rejecting it. People thought this was ironic because Alito was undoing an almost 50-year-old precedent, and then in rejecting an argument no one had even raised, reached for precedent in drawing that conclusion. The court also interestingly talked about its own legitimacy, saying if reversing Roe would damage the court as an institution, that was not something the justices themselves could care about. It was something that essentially wasn't the court's job to worry about. So this was an interesting moment in US history because it seemed that the court was behaving the way the anti-abortion movement had wanted, which was to say in a truly what we would consider counter-majoritarian way, meaning the court was not plugged in to what public opinion would provide. Now, you may ask, is that really the court's job? And it's true that the court is not supposed to be putting a finger to the wind, engaging popular opinion. But historically, the court's awareness of the political branches has always acted kind of on a check, as a check on a court that is now not elected, that really whose members cannot functionally be very easily removed at all, to ensure that the court wasn't taking on policy questions and deciding them with no accountability to the American people. It seems at the moment that the court has no concern for any kind of backlash or damage to itself as an institution, which opens the door to a lot of possibilities that will be deeply unpopular and consequential in terms of the structure of the democracy as a whole. The court's method, right, this idea that only rights deeply rooted in history and tradition exist, opens the door to the possibility that other rights will be on the chopping block too. This includes rights to birth control, rights to same-sex marriage, rights to same-sex intimacy, even rights to interracial marriage, all of which are unenumerated rights, and all of which would not have been widely recognized at the time the 14th Amendment was written. It also opens the door down the line to the possibility that the court will recognize or treat abortion as unconstitutional, although that's not something that happened in the Dobbs decision itself. The upshot after Dobbs was that each state would get to make its own decision about abortion. And at this date, there are about 13 or so that have already banned abortion throughout pregnancy. There are others that have laws that are being held up in court that would do the same thing. Progressive states have responded by introducing laws that would protect their own residents' ability to get an abortion, and also laws that would protect their residents from criminal or civil charges from out-of-state actors who are targeting them. Conversely, the anti-abortion movement hasn't been satisfied with the reversal of Roe, because for the movement, it was always about criminalizing all abortions, not just about getting rid of a right to abortion. So the question really, I think, for the anti-abortion movement is how to get there in a world where nonprofits can send medication from abroad, or certainly from out of state, and where Americans routinely travel out of state for a variety of reasons, including for other forms of healthcare. So one of the interesting questions then will be, how do anti-abortion groups go about this? There have been two strategies we've seen evolve, and we're really, I think, very early in learning which of them will be pursued the most vigorously. Some states are considering laws that would discourage or even prevent travel to other states. So these include measures that would punish corporations that reimburse their employees for abortion-related travel out of state, laws that would allow lawsuits against doctors or other helpers who perform abortions on people from states where abortion is illegal, laws that make it hard to get information about abortion that would, for example, punish internet service providers who host sites with information about medication abortion. Another strategy would look to the federal government and to the 2024 election. The most common method of abortion in the United States today involves abortion by pill. There's more than half of procedures that take place using these pills all early in pregnancy. So the idea of this strategy would be either to have a Republican president win in 2024 and influence the Food and Drug Administration to remove these pills from the market altogether, or conversely to look at a very old law, the Comstock Act, that had originally been used to ban books that were seen to be dirty books and the mailing of birth control and abortion pills. Anti-abortion groups argue that this law, the Comstock Act, which has never been repealed, makes it illegal to ban or to mail any abortion pills anywhere, to abortion clinics, to pharmacies, to patients, and that as such, at least abortion pills are illegal across the country. This is an argument that's targeting both the conservative Supreme Court, asking the court to interpret the law this way so that all abortion pills are impermissible, and it's an effort to target the Department of Justice, which could enforce the Comstock Act if a Republican president was in office. The challenge, of course, with these federal strategies and state strategies is that we know that many of these efforts would be pretty deeply unpopular. We know this in part because we just had a midterm election in the United States where Republicans, to the shock of many, failed to gain control of one house of Congress and barely, in a kind of historical underperformance, gained control of the other. And we know because when voters in the United States have been asked to weigh in directly on abortion rights through ballot initiative measures, abortion rights have won in all 6 of the proposals put to voters. And so in light of that, there are challenges, I think, for both anti-abortion activists in the Republican Party in figuring out how far to go with bans without triggering even more anger from voters who are not comfortable with where the party is and where the movement is on these fundamental issues of abortion. I think going forward, one of the interesting questions is really, I think, what this tells us about the health of American democracy. For some time, I think abortion has been a kind of canary in the coal mine about problems with American democracy. To many listeners, I think in Europe, American exceptionalism on abortion was a sign of something different about the American people. And there's some truth in that. Of course, Americans as a rule are more religious than many in Europe, although the fight to end Roe came at a time when America was secularizing and when Americans who identified as religious or as Christian or even as evangelical Christian, the numbers there were plummeting, and the numbers of Americans who identified as what Americans call nuns, that is to say, not affiliated with any religious tradition, that number was at a record high. There are other differences too, but I think ultimately American abortion politics were always a sign of a disconnect between what voters wanted and what parties were doing, and that parties were catering to the people who cared the most about abortion, that is to say, single issue voters and donors, rather than to the vast majority of Americans who were uncomfortable with where policy sat. The reversal of Roe, I think, by extension, came in part because of changes to the campaign spending system that empowered mega donors and super PACs over regular people, of voting laws that made it hard for people to vote altogether. And I think now going forward, what abortion policy looks like will also be kind of a stress test for democracy. It'll be interesting to see if we're going to arrive at a moment where abortion policy in America actually begins to resemble polling on abortion, or whether it continues to send a very different message about the erosion of democratic norms that culminated in something terrifying like the January 6th disaster after Donald Trump's failed attempt to subvert the last election. So I think what that means in part is, obviously, if you're listening to this lecture, you must think that abortion policy in America is interesting in its own right. I think that's true. It's interesting to see if the reversal of Roe has any trickle-down effects in other nations, or if instead it becomes yet another moment where American soft power is reduced and the Supreme Court is seen as a kind of unfortunate outlier at a time when many other nations across a variety of continents, including Central and South America, nations like Mexico, Argentina, and Asia as well, nations like Thailand and South Korea are liberalizing their rules, and certainly an outlier compared to much of Europe, where abortion is legal at least up until somewhere between the 12th and 15th week of pregnancy. But I think it's a reminder, again, that if you're worried about the United States, it's not so much that the United States is rabidly socially conservative in a way that Europe is not. While there's certainly that contingent, it's not representative of most of the American electorate on social issues. It's instead a story about how American politics can be captured by people who don't represent the majority of Americans or their views. And so going forward on this 50th anniversary of Roe, I'm curious to see which of those Americans we learn about. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Ziegler. That was very insightful. I think we have a question in the chat, so I'll just address that one first.
Sure.
Are you surprised that campaign finance and abortion politics became intertwined, or do you consider that to be inevitable? Was that a surprising point of your research when you found that correlation?
I was surprised, just because I tended to think, like most people who study law or campaign finance, that the groups that would be the most interested in campaign finance would be the wealthiest groups, right? So from a US politics watcher, like the Koch brothers, right, who are these like super wealthy oil barons who would have an incentive to deregulate campaign spending, because, you know, if you have the most money, you stand to gain the most from being able to spend as much as you want. And while anti-abortion groups in the United States are certainly not poor by any stretch of the imagination, they're definitely not the wealthiest organizations in American politics. And there was actually some debate within the anti-abortion movement about how much to get involved in campaign finance for just that reason. So I was surprised. I don't think it was inevitable. I think it partly had to do with the fact that the anti-abortion movement had become so enmeshed with the Republican Party. So there were a lot of people in the movement who were kind of libertarian on a campaign spending, and ready to see these synergies in a way that I don't think would have been true had the movement's political future been different.
Great, thank you. And then we have another question. You spoke a bit about this issue as well, so I guess we can just return to that for a moment. And the question is, do you think overturning Roe v. Wade will have an impact on similar laws that primarily concern women and queer people? So you spoke about the Supreme Court decision that some of these issues were mentioned. Have you seen maybe any examples of legislation already being put forward? If so, could you maybe discuss them a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, I think it could, in the sense that courts and certainly conservative movements in other parts of the world might say, it certainly creates new possibilities, right? Or allows conservatives in other parts of the world to imagine new possibilities, because it will mean that when there are victories for abortion rights or the rights of queer people in other countries, they will not seem as permanent, right, to conservative movements. It will sort of mean that, there's no harm in continuing to try. I think there's also obviously a playbook that was used by social conservatives in the United States that's available for people in other countries who are opposed to things like rights for women and queer people to learn from, right? I mean, this was a very successful effort, and there's information that's available about how to do it. Of course, the American anti-abortion movement has already been very international. It's already been, I think, inspiring activists in parts of the EU, I would say probably particularly Hungary and Poland, but elsewhere too, to some degree, France, less so Germany, Russia. It's been, not that Russia's in the EU, but Russia has been an area where there's been a lot of influence of the anti-abortion movement. I think the story in the global South is also interesting, because in parts of the global South, the Supreme Court may have more kind of influence or soft power than it would in parts of Europe. So it may be there that conservative lawyers can point to the reversal of Roe to say arguments for abortion rights are not as powerful. Obviously, that doesn't always work, because lots of other countries' legal and constitutional traditions are very different. Many of them, for example, are signatories to human rights treaties, which is like emphatically not true of the United States in a lot of ways. So there may be some sort of apples to oranges comparisons happening there that would limit the damage done. And of course, as happened with the election of Donald Trump, sometimes when things happen in the United States, it just makes people in other countries view the United States differently, rather than convincing them that they should follow the United States in whatever course has been taken. And I think there's more likely that will be what comes from Dobbs, but I do think that there are lessons that conservatives in other countries will take from Dobbs. Whether they can replicate those lessons, I think, is a different question.
Okay, thank you. Maybe also a bit related to this point, so the influence of Dobbs on international groups that are anti-abortion or that participate in the anti-abortion movement. Why in the US do you think the criminalization aspect is so important now for the anti-abortion movement and for legislation? Why is that happening, other than the fact that Roe v. Wade now, the overturning, gives states the power to implement this legislation? And why is it important that states do this?
Yeah, it's weird, because I mean, it's one of that is a way the US is an outlier, because it's not in lots of other countries, it's possible to think that fetal protections matter without that automatically meaning criminalization and serious criminalization too, right? I mean, it's worth emphasizing that in a lot of the states that have criminalized abortion, we're not talking about like someone loses their medical license and that's it. We're talking about, a felony punishable by 10 years or life in prison, right? Things that are pretty serious. And the US is, of course, more invested in incarcerating people than almost any other nation. That's part of the story. But I think there was, again, it comes down in part to the alignment of the anti-abortion movement with the Republican Party. The anti-abortion movement for a long time kind of debated what personhood would mean. Would it mean you needed to have more legal support for pregnant people? Would it mean that, certain kinds of laws were prohibited, but that no one needed to be prosecuted? Would it mean criminal prosecution? And I think the tiebreaker in part was in the 1980s, when the movement was needing the Republican Party's help. The Republican Party was becoming more and more focused on its tough on crime agenda. So this was when Ronald Reagan was advocating for drug laws that would put people of color in jail in record numbers in the United States, when there was massive amounts of new funding for the construction of private prisons and prisons in general, when, generally speaking, the victims' rights movement, which had existed before, became translated into a movement that argued the only way to vindicate victims was to punish the guilty very harshly. And the anti-abortion movement kind of hitched its star to that message and began advocating for harsher and harsher criminal penalties. And that's sort of still where we are. There's some pushback from that. There's some people in the anti-abortion movement now who are arguing not that you shouldn't have really harsh criminal penalties, but that you should have really harsh criminal penalties and some support for pregnant women, whether that's paid family leave or paid childcare. And so we're at a moment of some uncertainty, I think, for both movements in the abortion fight, because it's not clear what comes next. But I think it's kind of a function of American party politics, and also to a lesser extent the fact that America is a country that is just more punitive and more invested in incarceration than almost any in the world.
Yeah, and going off of that, maybe also just extremely more public with the sense of justice and criminalization, or maybe I'm thinking about the difference between US and Europe, maybe socially, that the US has this interest in the private life as public. We see that in politicians and celebrities, this interest in getting to know the value or a person's deep values and evaluating them also on a public scale, and then having that being open for public opinion. Whereas in Europe, I think there's more of a strict border or a strict line between the public life and the private life, also with politics still.
I think that's right too. I mean, and I think that, and the fact that 19th century sort of Victorian morals norms have held on more in the United States. And that's very clear in the abortion debate, because one of the reasons criminal laws about abortion gained a lot of support was because that was the status quo, right? That had been what the status quo was. And so that was one of the defaults. And that's, I think, a kind of UK-US connection. The UK had similar criminal laws as well. But I think that idea that, parts of people's private lives were not really private, but were in fact criminal, hung on for longer in the United States. And those, again, it's not everyone, but I think people in the communities that comprise the anti-abortion movement are particularly invested in that idea. And I think that was especially true because the anti-abortion movement itself has changed in recent years. So if you were looking at Roe v. Wade, that era, overwhelmingly the anti-abortion movement would be strong in places with large Catholic populations, which could be, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan. Now the movement is overwhelmingly strong in places with large white evangelical populations, which tend to be particularly, I think, plugged into the politics of the private in that way, right? And also, I think, particularly punitive. So I think part of what you're seeing is a function of the fact that those are the states that are producing all these abortion bills.
We spoke a lot about the Republican Party and the anti-abortion movement. Could you maybe give us an evaluation of the Democratic Party's actions towards abortion and abortion legislation in recent years?
Yeah, the Democratic Party kind of aligned with the pro-choice side around the same time that the Republican Party was going the other way, and that in part reflected the growing influence of women and people of color on the Democratic Party versus some of the more traditional party leaders who had been at the time kind of involved with the old labor movement, sort of like the old school social democrat types who were no longer as influential. The Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, had tried to kind of toe a line or move to the middle on abortion for some time. So, for example, the messaging was often like safe, legal, and rare. That's changed in recent years. So you see Democrats opposing any restrictions on abortion, including things like the public funding of abortion, which had been a kind of point of consensus in the United States in kind of weird and interesting ways. So I think the Democratic Party has moved more to the left on abortion. At the moment, I think that's a little bit harder to see because Democrats are now in a position where their views are probably a little closer to Americans' views in general, because most Americans think abortion is a right and should be legal, even if they also support restrictions that some Democrats may not support. At the moment, that's kind of less of an issue than it might have been because so many states are banning all abortions altogether.
Great. And speaking about both parties, do you think it's possible for people or politicians across party lines to find ways to have a dialogue about the issue? If so, have you seen this? Could you give some examples of this, if so?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen a lot of this when it comes to the ability to find consensus on abortion itself. I've seen it more with issues that relate to the reasons people may have abortions, right? So another way the US differs from much of Europe is that the US has a pretty tattered social safety net. So it's not a scenario. There are lots of people, if you look at like who has abortions in the United States, it's overwhelmingly low income people, and it's disproportionately low income people of color. And the reason for that in part is because some of those people would likely not have abortions if they had, for example, access to a better wage or better healthcare, or what they felt would be a better life. And so there's been a few isolated efforts to kind of address some of those reasons that people who might want to carry a pregnancy to term are not carrying a pregnancy to term. Just before the holiday season, there was a bill passed in the US called the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which currently requires employers to accommodate people who are pregnant in the same way you might have to accommodate someone in the United States with a disability. And that bill was passed with the support of both anti-abortion groups and abortion rights groups. So that kind of possibility, I think, is out there. I think it's much harder to imagine compromise on what abortion policy itself should look like. If that kind of compromise is going to happen, I think it's going to be because of voters. So these ballot initiatives really have to be tailored for the voters in a particular state, right? So if you go to a state that's more conservative, like Kentucky or Kansas, you're not going to ask them to do something that's super duper duper, to the left. And conversely, if you go to states like California, you're going to probably do something pretty progressive. So I think if we do have different solutions in different states, that may be a way to get a more stable consensus. The reason that's not a perfect solution is that every state has its own rules about when you can go directly to voters to ask them what rights they want to have. In some states, it's very hard to do that at all. Other states that have conservative majorities are thinking about ways to make it harder to go directly to voters. But I think that's a potentially promising tool in the United States going forward.
So although maybe we can interpret the overturning of Roe v. Wade as a threat to democracy, we will still need to employ the forces of democracy and probably grassroots movements efforts if people want to see a change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's more obviously the death of Roe came because of problems with the democracy, but I think what happens next is going to tell us more about how healthy or not healthy American democracy is. And I think there are signs pointing in both directions that way, really. I mean, I think the 2022 election was one where there were not really any questions about the legitimacy of the election, where voters were sort of splitting their votes depending on a variety of issues, where there were a lot of successful ballot initiatives. So it was, I think, a less scary moment where a lot of election deniers lost. Especially lost in elections that involved the ability to certify elections, right? So like secretaries of state, people along those lines, election officials. And so I think, if you're tracking how well American democracy is doing, the abortion debate is often a window into that. And I don't think we know yet, how that's all going to turn out.
Great. Maybe one final question. You're currently working on a history of the idea of fetal personhood. Do you have any insights on that research that are connected to your general abortion debate research that you could share with us? I'm curious.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, fetal personhood is related to the abortion debate. So this is the sort of what comes next in abortion in the US is this fight to ban abortion by latching on to the idea of fetal personhood. And so one of the things I was interested in is, why people latched onto the idea of fetal personhood, what it would mean, right? Would it change American ideas of equality beyond abortion? And the answer to that is yes. And also sort of why the US settled on the ideas of personhood that it did, which is to say ideas of personhood that were more punitive, that were more focused on punishing specific actors, right? So not women, but doctors and people who help them. And what that tells us about the US writ large, right? I think if you understand the personhood story, it's sort of a story about how Americans thought about and then rethought their ideas of equality, and in ways that I think are really consequential, even for people who could never get pregnant or have an abortion.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's all of the questions we have for you. Thank you for joining us and for giving a great lecture. Mary Ziegler, once again, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. To our audience members, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow our channel, and we hope to see you at future events, either here at our institute or online. Thank you.